Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're going to be taking a look at something that's probably been on a lot of people's minds lately,
Yeah,
and that's grocery prices.
absolutely.
And, our awesome listeners sent in some great material for us to dig into this time. A really thorough piece from USA Today and some interesting excerpts from a Como News report. And the mission for this deep dive is to really see how these tariffs that have been put in place are going to impact what we're all paying for groceries.
Yeah.
What items are going to be hit the hardest, what's the reasoning behind all of this, and also to kind of get a feel for, the different perspectives that are out there on these changes.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like getting a crash course in how these trade decisions actually play out in your weekly shopping trips.
Yeah, exactly.
And the material you've got here, it's perfect because it gives us that mix of expert predictions and real people's reactions, both shoppers and people from the industry. And I think that's crucial to getting the full picture.
For sure. For sure. Okay, so let's jump into this USA Today article. Right off the bat, hits us with this pretty startling estimate from this food industry analyst named Phil Lempert. He was talking with NPR, and he said probably almost half of the product in the supermarket, about 40,000 products, are going to be affected by these tariffs, whether it's the entire product or just, one ingredient.
Wow.
40,000,
That's a lot.
yeah, that's a lot to think about, right? It really makes you realize how global, our grocery baskets really are.
It really does. It really does. And I think it brings up a point that maybe a lot of people don't really consider, which is that even the things that seem very local can be affected by global forces.
Mhm.
A simple can of soup could have ingredients from all over the world. And if a couple of those countries are suddenly subject to tariffs, well, you're going to see that reflected in the price.
Yeah, totally. And the article makes it clear, these tariffs aren't just happening out of the blue. They're being called reciprocal tariffs. And they're specifically aimed at countries that already have their own tariffs on goods coming from the U.S. It's like a back and forth kind of thing in the trade world.
Yeah, tit for tat.
Exactly, tit for tat. And there's even this term the article uses, dirty 15. It refers to the 15 countries that have like the biggest trade surpluses with us and what they consider to be high barriers to trade. So it's not just about the tariffs themselves, but also how difficult they make it for our products to get into their markets.
Right. And if you look at how the Trump administration is framing this, and the USA Today piece actually has a quote from them via ABC News, it's clear that they see these tariffs as a way of, righting some wrongs, essentially. They feel that these countries have been taking advantage of the U.S. for years and that these tariffs are a way to recoup some of what's been lost.
Yeah, they use some pretty strong language too. The quote actually says that these countries have ripped us off and that the tariffs represent substantial money for the country. So it's definitely not just about economics. It's also about making a statement, you know?
Absolutely. There's a lot of, emotion and principle wrapped up in this.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think it's important to remember that all of this is happening on top of, tariffs that were already put in place earlier this year, like 20% on imports from China and 25% on those from Mexico and Canada. So it's not like we're starting from scratch here.
Right. It's like layer upon layer. And that's something to keep in mind when we're trying to figure out how this is all going to affect what we pay at the grocery store. It's not just about these new tariffs, it's about the cumulative effect of all of them.
Exactly. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty here and talk about what specific items are likely to see the biggest price increases. The USA Today article starts with fruits, which seems like a good place to start.
Yeah.
And the situation there is kind of a mixed bag,
Yeah.
It looks like tropical fruits coming from Central and South America, places like Guatemala, Costa Rica, Peru, are likely to be hit pretty hard with a 10% tariff. So things like bananas, melons, plantains, papayas, pineapples, even avocados and mangoes, if they're coming from those regions, could definitely become more expensive.
Yeah, but what's really interesting here is that Canada and Mexico, which were actually the biggest suppliers of fresh fruit to the U.S. in 2022, they're not subject to these specific tariffs. And the article really emphasizes this distinction. So you know that apple you're buying or those strawberries, they might not be affected at all if they're coming from our neighbors to the north. But if they're coming from further south, you might see a difference in price.
Yeah, that's a great point. And speaking of differences, Lempert actually brings up a really important point about fruits. He points out that they have a pretty short shelf life. So these tariffs could create some real challenges in terms of both price and availability. If it suddenly costs more, it takes longer to get these fruits into the country. Well, some of them might not even make it to the shelves, or they might be, more expensive and less fresh by the time they do.
It's a delicate balance, right? And perishable goods are always the most vulnerable to any kind of disruption in the supply chain, whether it's tariffs or, weather events or anything else. But there is one bit of good news here, at least for avocado lovers. The article specifically mentions that avocados from Mexico, which make up the vast majority of U.S. imports, something like 87%, actually might not be subject to these reciprocal tariffs. So maybe guacamole won't become a luxury item just yet.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Okay, so moving on to vegetables. The USA Today article suggests that the situation there is somewhat similar to fruits in that our biggest suppliers, Mexico and Canada, are likely to be okay. But they do list a whole bunch of other countries: Guatemala, Costa Rica, Peru, again, Ecuador, Chile, Honduras, Morocco, and even China, whose vegetable imports could see some price increases.
Right. So while your tomatoes and bell peppers might be safe for now, depending on where they're coming from, there are definitely other vegetables that could become more expensive. And it's also worth noting that the U.S. has become increasingly reliant on imported vegetables over the years. The article mentions that the volume of fresh vegetable imports increased by almost 200% between 1998 and 2020, and the value of what we import far exceeds what we export. So it's clear that we're not exactly self-sufficient when it comes to our veggies.
Yeah, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about seafood now. This is a category where the USA Today article really sounded the alarm bells. They point out that the U.S. imports up to 85% of the seafood we consume.
85%.
Yeah, that's a huge amount.
It is.
So if all that seafood is coming from elsewhere and those countries are suddenly hit with tariffs, well, you can bet that's going to have a significant impact on prices. And the article specifically mentions some of the biggest suppliers: Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Chile. They're all facing different tariff rates. But the bottom line is that seafood is likely to get more expensive.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is that the domestic industry just can't make up for that kind of volume. The article quotes Andy Herrig from the Food Industry Association, who says that there's no way our local fishermen can suddenly catch enough to fill that gap. So the increased cost of importing seafood is pretty much guaranteed to trickle down to us, the consumers. And this really makes you think, will this change what kinds of seafood we see in the stores or what we can afford to buy?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of people are going to be asking themselves that, okay, so let's move on to another staple for a lot of folks: coffee. The U.S. is the world's biggest coffee importer, and a big chunk of our roasted imports comes from Latin America, specifically Brazil and Colombia. And guess what? Both of those countries are facing a 10% reciprocal tariff.
Yeah, not good news for coffee drinkers.
Not good news at all. And the article says that over 60% of our roasted coffee imports come from those two countries. So that 10% tariff could definitely make a noticeable difference in the price of your morning cup.
Absolutely, that daily ritual might start costing you a bit more.
Yeah, okay, so if you like to unwind with a glass of wine or a cold beer, well, the imported alcohol market, as Lempert puts it, is likely to be clobbered.
Yeah.
Ouch is right. The tariffs aren't the same across the board, though. The European Union, which includes some of the biggest wine producers like France, Italy, and Spain, they're facing a 20% tariff, and then New Zealand and Australia are getting hit with a 10% tariff on their wines. So
Yeah.
if you're a fan of imported wines, especially from Europe, you're probably going to feel this one.
Yeah, and while we import a lot of beer from Mexico and Canada, which might escape these tariffs, the Netherlands and Ireland, which are also big players in the beer market, they're facing a 20% tariff. So your favorite imported beers from those regions could see a price jump too.
And it gets even worse for beer drinkers.
Uh-huh.
Lempert points out that because of the tariffs on aluminum producers like China, beer in cans could be doubly impacted. So it's not just the beer itself that's getting more expensive, it's the packaging too.
Wow, yeah, that's a real double whammy. And it's a perfect example of how these tariffs can have these ripple effects throughout the whole supply chain. One thing leads to another, and suddenly everything's more expensive.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so olive oil, another staple in a lot of kitchens, is also likely to see a price hike. The U.S. relies heavily on imports for olive oil, and most of it comes from the European Union, specifically Spain, Italy, and Greece. And Lempert says that olive oil prices, which were already on the rise, are expected to climb even higher because of these tariffs.
Yeah, it seems like there's a clear pattern emerging here. The products where the U.S. is really dependent on imports are the ones that are most vulnerable to these price increases.
Yeah, absolutely. And for cheese lovers out there, certain cheeses from the European Union like Parmigiano, Reggiano, Brie Gouda, they could all become more expensive, so that next cheese board you put together might cost you a bit more.
Yeah, that's a bummer. Okay, so are there any bright spots here? I mean, are there any items that might actually be okay?
Well, the USA Today article does mention a few items that might be less impacted, mainly because they're mostly produced domestically. Beef is a good example. About 90% of the beef we consume is produced right here in the U.S.
Okay, so burgers are safe.
Well, not so fast. The article also points out that even with beef, there's still a chance of price increases because prices are already high. And the cattle herd is actually at its smallest size since 1951. So even domestically produced goods aren't completely immune to these broader market pressures.
Okay, so maybe just a little bit more for those burgers?
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit. And then rice is another interesting case of most of the rice we eat is grown here in the U.S., but we still import about a third of it, mainly jasmine rice from Thailand and basmati rice from India. And both of those countries are on the White House's list for these tariffs, so you might see some price increases there as well.
Okay, so not everything is safe, but at least we've got a better idea now of where the biggest impacts are likely to be.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the USA Today article gives us a pretty comprehensive overview, but now I want to switch gears and look at the Como News report to get a sense of, what shoppers and the grocery industry are actually saying and doing about all of this on the ground.
Yeah, let's hear from the people in the trenches.
Yep.
Exactly. So the report talks to this independent grocer who didn't want to be identified, but they said that they have dozens of vendors who are going to be affected by these tariffs. And they really stress the uncertainty around the whole thing. Like, nobody really knows exactly how this is going to play out. And that sense of uncertainty seems to be pretty widespread.
Yeah, it's like trying to predict the weather. There are all these factors at play, and it's hard to say for sure what's going to happen.
Totally. And then the report interviews this shopper named Wesley McCain,
Mm.
and he really brings it home.
Mm.
He talks about how groceries are already expensive in Seattle, and he's worried that these tariffs are just going to make things worse. He specifically mentions olive oil, wine chocolates, all things that we just talked about from the USA Today analysis.
Yeah, he's really putting a face on those potential price increases. It's not just numbers on a page. It's real people having to make tough choices at the grocery store. Yeah, absolutely. And the Washington State Food Industry Association chimed in too. They gave Como News a list of produce items that are going to be hit with a 10% tariff: grapes, citrus asparagus,
Yeah.
avocado. It's interesting because the USA Today article suggested that avocado from Mexico might be exempt. So it just goes to show how complicated this all is, what could explain that discrepancy.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it highlights the fact that trade regulations and tariffs can be incredibly complex. There are all these specific product codes and layers of tariffs, and sometimes it's not entirely clear how they're going to be applied in practice, so it's possible that there are different types of tariffs at play here, or that there's some confusion about how these new reciprocal tariffs apply to certain avocado imports. But it definitely underscores the need for businesses to have a really solid understanding of all these rules and how they affect their particular supply chains.
Yeah, for sure. It's a minefield out there. Okay, so another shopper that Como News talked to said that she's worried about having to buy less quality food and cutting back on things like wine and coffee. And this really shows, how these tariffs could actually change people's buying habits and the choices that are available to them.
Absolutely. When the cost of everyday items goes up, people have to adjust, and that often means either switching to cheaper alternatives or simply buying less overall. And that can have a ripple effect on the businesses that sell these products as well.
Yeah, it's all connected, right? Okay, so the Como News report also includes this perspective from the state Republican Party chair, Jim Walsh, and he argues that tariffs, when they're used strategically and swiftly, can actually be a really effective tool for ensuring fair trade and for giving the U.S. leverage in negotiating better trade deals. He basically says, give it time, let's see if this actually works.
So that's the other side of the coin, right?
Right.
The argument that these tariffs are a necessary pain in the short term in order to achieve these bigger economic goals in the long run.
Yeah, exactly. And Como News reached out to some big supermarket chains like Kroger and also some smaller local markets. And the general consensus seems to be that it's still too early to say for sure how this is all going to shake out. Yeah. They're still trying to figure out how much their costs are going to increase and how they're going to respond, whether it's finding new suppliers, absorbing some of the costs themselves, or passing those costs on to the consumers.
Yeah, that makes sense. They need time to assess the situation and come up with a plan.
Yeah, and then there's this one shopper in the Como News report who makes this really great point. She says that even if it's just a few extra dollars here and there on different items, it all adds up. And it can force a lot of families to really tighten their belts and stick to just buying the essentials.
Yeah, that's the cumulative effect we were talking about earlier. It's not just about one or two luxury items getting more expensive. It's about the potential for price increases across a wide range of products, and that can really put a strain on household budgets.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so on a slightly more optimistic note, the State Food Industry Association says that they expect to see an increase in demand for domestically produced goods, but they don't think there are going to be any shortages, at least not right away.
Okay. But they did say for now. Right, so
Yeah.
there's still a chance that things could change down the line.
Yeah, that's true. If there's a big surge in demand for domestic products, well, who knows what could
That's
happen.
right, supply and demand. It's a powerful force.
Exactly. And one last thing from the Como News Report, they did a pulse poll asking people what their biggest concern was about the Trump administration's tariff strategy. And the top answer by a pretty significant margin was soaring consumer costs. 39% of the people who responded said that was their main worry.
Wow, so almost 40%. And that really lines up with the concerns we heard directly from those shoppers in the report. It seems like the potential for higher grocery prices is a really big deal for a lot of people. Yeah, it is. Okay, so taking all of this into account, it's pretty clear that these tariffs have the potential to really shake things up at the grocery store.
Mhm.
The extent of the impact is still a bit of a question mark, but it seems like we can expect to see higher prices on a wide range of imported goods, especially things like tropical fruits, certain vegetables, seafood, coffee, imported alcohol, olive oil, and some cheeses.
Right, and it's important to remember that even domestically produced items might not be totally safe because of how interconnected the global supply chain is. And, the whole point of these tariffs is to encourage domestic manufacturing and to create a more level playing field in terms of trade. But the immediate impact is likely to be felt by us, the consumers, in the form of higher prices at the checkout.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to the big question for our listeners. Given that grocery prices are likely to go up at least to some extent,